Hello, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Abhinav Trivedi, and you're watching Live Mint. There was a time when India's identity was only confined to a land of snake charmers, ladies and gentlemen. To some, we were also known only for the Taj. India was amongst the founders of the non aligned movement when the Cold War era split the world into two halves. Since the year 1991, India has ushered into the era of global economic reforms, open market, and free trade. Today, the country has become the fourth to land on the moon, surpassed China as the world's most populous country, and overtaken the United Kingdom as the world's fifth largest economy in terms of GDP growth. With 65% of the country's population below the age of 40, and the world going through the big five crises of inflation, war, food security, green versus fossil, and debt, India, as the president of G20, has a balance ahead of itself. Armed with philosophies of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one planet, India's G20 presidency is the culmination of a year of milestones. What can we do best to leverage this summit and establish ourselves as the new face of progress and inclusiveness? Will it be strategic autonomy in our foreign policy? Will it be the voice of the global south? Will it be focused on developing digital payment infrastructure for the world? Or will it be balanced trade policies, acting as a mediator between the East and the West, without a notion of being biased towards any? It may be also presenting ourselves as an alternative to China, strategically and economically. We shall find out in few hours. But for now, I have with me Srinath Sridharan. He's a strategic counsel and a renowned author of the book Time for Bharat. We also have Mr. S.C. Garg, who's a former finance secretary, to discuss just this. Gentlemen, I welcome both of you. Now,
Thank you.
Srinath, I'll come to you first. Although a joint statement still looks a distant possibility, but what, according to you, could be the best outcomes which India can negotiate? We have 15 bilateral meetings lined up. Anything specific which you think can happen for our benefit or which portrays us as the leader and a peace mediator, considering the geopolitics we are in?
So interesting. The peace mediator, I'm not too sure, but I think putting our best foot forward in terms of be it the digital public goods or have been seen as the voice of global south, I think that's a doable one. And I think India has been talking about it the last couple of months. But I think far more importantly, I would simply say that there are 5 Ds that I think India has been showcasing. Every single G20 meetings culminating in the summit or the subcommittees that have happened. One is
Okay.
development. I think talking about development, talking about digital, talking about data. I mean, if you look at each of the subsegments of whether it is finance, crypto, conversation around AI, so development, digital, data, and I think the one earth, one world kind of concept, Dharati, speaking about it. And I think that's where we are all going to culminate in this. The challenge is,
Okay.
will everybody agree? I don't think so. I think each of the Western nations, they use, for example, let's say data and digital. Why would a Western nation give up its position or at least the supremacy in Web 1 and Web 2? Web 3 could be a very, very different game. And I think that's where the challenges of this. And I also want to point out one of the highlights that the Sherpa G20 Sherpa Indian Sherpa had mentioned a couple of months ago was this. He said the joint statement at the end of the summit, he does not anticipate it to be just pure words, but actually milestone-led goals that they could give it. And
Hmm.
I'm actually watching it for it. I mean, will it be English or will it be math related, date related to English?
Okay, English or maths. Garg Saab, you have been into government positions for quite long and last few decades. What is your assessment of the summit which has come out so far, and what do you take? I mean, is there specific outcome which you relate, which can portray us as a global leader and a mediator, especially from the economic and finance angle?
See, G20 meetings are not sort of leadership led meetings. These are the presidency is a kind of convener of the G20 groups and the summits
Sure.
during the year in which it does. So, portraying this as a kind of World Cup or as a kind of where some country is winning over the others or besting the others or getting the best deals out, I think is not a correct characterization. I, by the way, attended two of these G20 summits myself personally, so I know a little bit about it for sure. So
Enlighten us, please.
so what India wanted to achieve, and rightly so, as it being its president for the year, to get some traction on some of the important global issues, some of which Srinath mentioned. There is a large indebtedness in a very low income country. That's not a new thing. It has been, they have been indebted for long. There is conversation around the digital currency, the cryptocurrency, and all. There is this payment infrastructure, which is also related to this. The green growth issue. So these are some of the important issues which the world is facing, and India wanted to make it sort of forward movement on this. That is what we should be judging, whether we have been able to do it. These are by no means simple issues. These are complex issues. And even if you make some incremental progress in this during your presidency, that's much better. Now, looking from this point of view, whether we have made progress on the goals which we set out as our priorities, honestly, you would find that not much progress has been made on any. It's not India's fault. It is the problematic nature of the. Let's take, for example, the debt issue. The debt today, they are never discussing the multilateral and private debts, because that has a very different dimensions. Nobody gives it up. It's basically bilateral debt. And in bilateral debt, much of it today is Chinese debt. Now, China is not willing to come on board. And therefore, how can you have a deal on the debt? That is the kind of reason it looks. Look at the cryptocurrencies. On that, India wanted a global regulatory kind of arrangement to come up because of its nature itself, right? But you might have seen the synthesis paper which IMF and the FSB had put out. There, if you read it very carefully, they assume that the crypto assets are going to be there. These are not to be banned, or these cannot be eliminated. What it suggests is that now you can think about how do you deal with it? How do you handle the financial stability issues? How do you handle monetary policy issues and all? So on the whole, if I may summarize, the India made its best effort. It couldn't make much of traction on these issues. It did get something of a foot in by getting the African Union as 21st member, which is, I think, what it will be remembered for. But on other things, whether it's green growth, debt, crypto, etc., not much progress is being made.
Sure. Srinath, like Mr. Garg mentioned, these are complicated issues which involve multiple parties. I mean, do you believe that there could be some clarity as far as crypto and central bank digital currencies are concerned? As far as regulation of these two entities are concerned, do you see some clarity coming out of the summit, or do you still think that we are shooting in the dark?
So I don't think G20 is going to decide a crypto kind of regulation at all. It can't. I mean, it doesn't have the authority to decide. It has to go
at least
back
the clarity.
To clarity.
If
I
not
don't
a regulation,
think so.
at least the clarity.
So I think one of the things that I've been speculating and have been open about is, at best, G20 might come with what I call a basic minimum program, something almost sounding like a political party, and say this is what we will do, and push it to BIS or IMF to say, in the next 1 year, why don't you guys figure out a range of regulation, and then leave it to individual financial regulator. I mean, how will we feel? How will India or RBI feel if some other nation comes and tells us what regulation we should have for our market? So, which is why I think the basic common minimal program could be a face saver for everybody. And I think crypto, I think right from the word go from 2008 has been kind of doomed, right? I mean, you're actually questioning the authority of the state when it comes to who owns the currency. You're taking on the mighty sovereigns.
Central banks.
The second challenge that none of us are relating to, how the US will behave. The largest crypto market is actually the US. Despite all the challenges that they've had, crypto exchanges blowing up, millions of customers losing their money, US has had a kind of a mixed bag of reaction. SEC has been taking some of the crypto exchanges to the Supreme Court. And the so-called free press and free speech kind of movement that the US has, it won't be easy for US government to get up and say, I ban crypto from tomorrow. I think one of the way for everybody would be to say that it may not be a currency, but can it be a digital asset, virtual digital asset, which means that in the Indian context, it won't come under the purview of RBI, but it could come under the purview of SEBI. If you treat it as almost like a stock market, there could be a VDA, virtual digital asset exchange. I think that's something that we need to be kind of thinking about. And it's also another fact, right? One generation ago or two generations of Indians ago, we have seen our parents very commonly say cash was king. Today, we don't even carry our wallet, right? I mean, everything is in UPI, everything is in phone. A lot of things have changed. But does it mean that if somebody had envisaged mobile banking 10 years ago was a fool? Not really. So I think we'll have to be ready for what is the value that the private market is ready to pay. A broken Ming vase broken into thousands of pieces still gets a value of probably a couple of $100 million in a private investors market. So if two parties are ready to transact, what will we do? So that is a larger challenge for governments and regulators. And I think it's like the scratch cards or the flip books that the school kids will trade with each other, right? But there was a perceived and transactional value. So I think that's where we will have to start thinking of what makes the youngsters tick. The larger one is in the financial inclusion conversation. Are people really getting benefit of governmental policies? And that was the genesis of the entire crypto, that the governments are not getting taken care of the large sets of population. And there was this global financial crisis, 2008 crash that happened. So the question mark will remain. And I think that's a challenge that most of the governments don't have an answer for, be it the large democracies or the underdeveloped ones.
Sure. Now, taking from your point, Srinath, Mr. Garg, let me come to you. You mentioned high debt. A couple of years ago, when COVID happened, US Federal Reserve let all the balls loose and interest rates were to their lowest. And that money found its way into equity markets, as opposed to what Federal Reserve was thinking or promising, at least on paper. Now, what we saw afterwards was high inflation. And initially, the Federal Reserve denied that this inflation will likely stick. It's transitory, according to them. Do you think that, currency war, which has been the focus between the East and the West, and of lately there were conversation amongst BRICS to use national currency, if not a common currency. Do you think there will be very strong-headed discussions on how to use currency as a diplomatic tool going forward? I mean, I'm not indicating de-dollarization, but at least an alternative to dollar.
See, that's your diagnosis about the inflation in US. I think need to be a little bit supplemented by what the US government did on the fiscal front. There was a lot of grant-based support, helicopter money, assistance, which the US government provided. There were checks received by almost 60% of the US households. And that raised the available resources for spending with the people. The Fed money went more into the business accounts and banks and all. It was not used so much for consumption as the government money was used. And that is in the face of a situation where there was supply constraint, because supply was constrained and disrupted. You had the inflation. So my sense is that when the government undid the program, rolled it back, stopped giving this, the inflation started getting somewhat corrected. And today, the inflation is not as much. The US is also getting into 3%, 4% kind of situation. And so monetary policy keeps on working. But the real reason behind
that eventually results in US raising its debt ceiling, which has implications for all the world.
See, the US debt ceiling is the issue because exactly the US government borrows more, and therefore it requires higher ceiling. Right. So it borrowed more, and still, even for its normal, because it runs large fiscal deficit, and therefore you need. So that issue is connected with the requirement of the U.S. government to borrow. Now, coming to your question about the currency war, basically, the G20 has never discussed the currency issue in last its 15 years of existence, because the underlying assumption is that the world runs on dollar. Others are coming in to sort of occupy a little bit of space, whether it's a euro or the Chinese renminbi. So Chinese renminbi came in 2015 and got 2 to 3% of the IMF basket. The currency issues has never been discussed. Therefore, there is no question of either a rupee or any other currency even being thought of as a challenger or a competitor. Now, action on currency is happening outside GST, outside the G20. The Chinese economy has grown very, very much. The Russians have faced problems. You would remember after the Ukraine war, the Americans have seized their reserves, which were lying with the US federal agencies.
So you think there won't be any discussion on the currency aspect at G20?
Absolutely not. So that action, where now the Chinese-Russian axis is developing an alternative currency framework to deal and have the trade amongst themselves. And so now you have I think it's better to accept that the global economic order is now two-pillar order. The US-European pillar and the Chinese-Russian pillar, right? That is the pole position. So they are taking it. I don't think they're going to succeed very soon. The US dollar will continue to be the face and the currency. It's very difficult for the people to do transactions in more than one currency. Whether it was gold earlier and the dollar now, or in between sterling, and in times to come, unless you conceive the world as virtually two parts, two segments themselves. So I don't think the currency issue is there on the table.
Currency won't be discussed according to you. So that goes out of the door. Srini, let me come back to you. You have mentioned a lot about green energy. India has pushed for green reforms, and Russia and Saudi Arabia recently opposed to those green reforms because they're the fossil giants. Where do you think conversations and diplomatic tools would be used as far as converging to green energy and achieving our green goals is concerned?
So I think the reality about green is there, whether people accept it or not. One of the largest investments globally in the green space is actually in Saudi Arabia. I mean, amount of money that they're spending in green hydrogen, they're building a large city where they want to be actually carbon neutral or carbon negative, so to speak. So from that perspective, I think we'll have to understand that governments, the optics around what they say and what happens behind is something I think we'll have to leave it to probably a few thousand bureaucrats and officers who understand that. I think as a corporate citizen, if I look at it, I think I wouldn't go by the semantics of every word that comes in, because the end of the day, this G20 outcome, whatever is the document going to be put up, probably is worse than actually getting 100 lawyers working on that document on a transaction. And they're going to fight for every single word and positions will be taken. So green is the reality. And I think if you look at India, I mean, the sheer number of population, we all speak about the demographic dividend and the youth power as the soft power. But we also have a large challenge of giving them for the energy needs as we all grow older. I think that's the reality as the economy increases. Simple things like an average room in India, I used to have about 4 electrical points 10 years ago. And today that has nearly doubled. So these are the things that we're going to guzzle energy. Look at our own mobile phones. Most of us carry the battery charger or the juicers around. The car vehicles have it. We want EV chargers. But guess what? They're not green. At some point at the back end, it's all fossil.
You think that the leaders, that what they say and what they do, there's a big difference as far as green energy is concerned. I mean, the sale of green bonds and the takers of green bonds are at an all-time low in the last decade or so. So you think that this is more of a lip service which is happening right now?
Not
As you said,
really.
optic.
I think I want to give a very classic parallel example what we've seen the last 1 year, right? I mean, the Western nations kind of banned Russia and sanctioned against it. But guess what? They all have been buying fuel from Russia via India and other countries. So I think you can
Correct.
take a global position and say, I ban you, I hate you, all that. But you kind of find an alternate route because of domestic politics. I mean, let's not forget G20, each of the leaders present here have to win their local elections. That's a
Correct.
reality. It's a political battle, it's domestic politics. But what they're demonstrating today is actually international politics of where they agree, may not agree. But when they go back to their state, they still have to win the next election. So I think that's the reality that each of them take positions. And I think let's not forget G20 is one of the multilateral institution or a group
Correct.
block of nations. And in the last 10 years, 20 years ago, we thought UN was the only one. And today we are like G20. Tomorrow, what started as G7, 8, now 20, it will become 32.
It might extend, the number might extend.
Just like BRIC became BRICS, and now I don't know how many more alphabets we will add. I think these are things that we will have to figure out in the 21st century.
Sure, sure. Now, let me come to the next part of the conversation. Mr. Garg, you think, because India has been trying to project itself as the voice of the global South, one of the most common issues which the global South faces is food insecurity, which has been exacerbated by the Russia-Ukraine war. To address this challenge, what do you think could be the right steps? What could be the right diplomatic pitches? And what essentially can be done to solve this problem globally?
See, this global South, the concept has evolved over time. When this word was conceived in 60s for the first time, the Indias and Chinas were very much part of the global South, so to say. The North, global North, was a much smaller sort of entity, the US and some of the European countries and Japan at best. Now, a lot has moved. Today, the World Bank has 87 countries which are high-income countries. Now, they are not global South any longer. It includes many countries like South Africa, New Zealand, and the Australians, or even Taiwan, many of these countries which were earlier poor. So today, in my judgment, the global South is basically confined to the Africa and some of the Middle East and to South Asia, Asian countries. I won't include, or maybe there are some countries in the Latin America.
Sure.
It's a much smaller kind of thing.
As far as food security is concerned.
Now, for the food security, the global South is not one homogeneous entity. The Latin American countries are sort of more than so self-sufficient in food. Brazil is one of the largest exporters and Argentina is also a goods exporter. India now has become a very large exporter of rice and all. So today, in fact, the global availability of food is much better than it was 30 or 40 years back. Of course, we are no longer importing or dependent on the US wheat, but likewise, a lot of other countries are also not dependent. Today, the situation is different. So when Ukraine and Russian war happens, the Ukraine and the Russians, which are the global suppliers of wheat, they are unable to supply. Their supplies get disrupted. Or India faces a situation where there is either drought or flood or something. It sort of restricts the export of wheat and the export of rice also, right? That is what creates. I don't think it's a north-south issue as far as food is concerned. It's basically south issue today. And therefore, if you want to solve it, you can solve it within the South itself, so to say. You don't require North's cooperation in that sense.
How can you do that?
You see, here we will probably need to be a little more responsible. Now, if you are not an Indian or you're living in Africa somewhere, you would be questioned that why did you stop the rice exports? Or they would be questioning the Ukrainians that why are you not able to, why did you go to war and not supplying the wheat to us? Therefore, if you need
But
to have,
today, an average African family spends 70% of their savings on food. Isn't that a concern for you? I mean, does that not is that
no,
not a food
that's
insecurity?
exactly not correct. In India, our food weight is less than 45% in the consumer price index. And in fact, if you were to update, because this is 2011 number, the food expenditure of the consumption basket in India is not even 40%. We have graduated out of food and we are spending much more. That's why we are better off. But if you were to ask the same question in Africa, most of the countries in Africa still would be spending 70% on food.
Correct.
Because they don't produce other things, they don't consume other things, they're poor people. Therefore, if in my judgment, if you were to shift the food trade also on the market and take out most of these restrictions which countries impose and allow the free market to actually take place on food, probably this problem would also go away.
Sure. Srinath, food security, you think it will be a point of discussion at this G20 since Africa has also been a new addition? Srinath, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi. I lost you for a couple of seconds. Could you just repeat?
Okay, no problem. I said that do you think food security agenda at this G20 since Africa has also been a new addition?
See, I think Africa has lots of challenges, not just about food security. And I think Africa, looking at Africa as one single unit, is a wrong thing that every government has faced at its own peril. I mean, if you look at linguistically, there is a Francophile African nation, there's English speaking. There are some nations which have rich resources. There are some African nations which are at the mercy of China, having given up each of their countries' commodities and resources. So we'll have to segregate Africa as a very, very different unit. And I think this is where I just want to go back to that global South conversation that you raised, Abhinav. I think the global South narrative goes back very, very differently. I think one of the influence, according to me, is money. The rich nations kind of promised almost everything to the world. And in terms of the climate change conversations, nothing has come up.
Sure.
So
now coming back.
Go
okay,
ahead.
I thought that I lost you. I thought I lost you. Yes.
So I think that
Please
global
go
South
ahead.
narrative comes back to money. The Western rich nations have been promising for a long time that they would pump in climate financing, adaptation financing, and all we saw was empty promises. And I think unity in numbers is always good, right? I mean, so suddenly if you club the global South and you're saying that we're all supposedly the recipients and the folks who are going to face the brunt of this climate change, and here we have a voice. And I think that's a very interesting diplomatic or / political move for the global South to come together and India voicing that. I think it's an interesting geopolitical context. I think we did not have that voice or the muzzle to flex, so to speak, many, many decades ago, years ago. Today, with our economic ascent, I wouldn't call it supremacy yet, ascent. We have lots of our own internal challenges which we'll have to solve for. I think our overall economic growth has been fantastic, but that's aggregate. It has not been necessarily across every single SEC background. So I think global South comes there, and I think Africa today, I think more than merrily will join that group. But what is going to come to them in the African Union, and do the African leaders themselves follow the diktats of African Union will be an interesting one. It's almost like saying G20 will pass the decision, give it back to African nation, and expect the 54 African countries to follow and have a consensus. I think we will leave it to a couple of months now.
Sure. Now, Mr. Garg, let me come to you. You have been in the finance ministry for quite many years now. If you had to advise the government this year on what to do right to get its presidency correct, what would that advice be?
See, the presidency is literally over now. So, with the leaders' summit taking place tomorrow, the presidency's work is over. you will still technically go until 1st of December when the Brazil will formally take over. And maybe you would have a meeting along with the World Bank IMF meeting in October. Where I don't think it's time to give advice because you can't actually act upon. But you're not going out of the G20. You will remain in G20. And that is where, to my mind, and you would also remain a part of what we call troika. So they're always the presidency plus two, the outgoing presidency and the incoming presidency, that together form a troika, and many of the discussions in terms of the agenda, etc., gets decided there. Now, so India would remain part of the troika for one more year. What you can do, as always, I think the countries would put their own economic and financial interests first. G20, please remember, is a coordinational, cooperational body. It doesn't have any executive mandate. It doesn't decide anything. Even in what it decides, it is then passed on to the concerned agency. For example, if India pursued it very aggressively, that the multilateral institutions' mandate should be sort of rethought. Encasing summer committee report, the volume 1 is available, the volume 2 will come, which will get discussed in the October meeting of the IMF and the World Bank. So you can still take what you think will serve yourself and the so-called global South's interest much more. For example, taking even this one, whether you can get the multilateral systems redesigned for meeting the challenges of future is something worth doing. Now, if you have seen, the report says that you add one more mandate of financing the global public goods to the two mandates which are already there, the eradication of extreme poverty, and the boosting of shared prosperity. Now, if that mandate gets added, the most critical question would be to actually work it, because it's not easy to get the financing from the global goods, so to say. Who takes the finance? Who takes that borrowing? Right, for doing something which the global benefit would be there. What kind of mechanism? This committee talks about a new finance challenge mechanism for getting the finance for the global public goods. Now, it's a very complex, very difficult, but if you can take that leadership and get this particular only one thing sort of implemented and accepted, and the capitalization of multilaterals, because believe me, the challenges are again very difficult. Even the multilateral system is now getting bifurcated. You have one China-led system which is there. AIB is there. NDB also is going that way with the BRICS expansion of China sympathizer countries coming in, and the Americans and Europeans are not as keen to expand and put in more capital on the World Bank, IMF. So you have a very challenging situation as far as even the multilaterals are concerned. So my advice to respond to you is to choose one or two or three big issues, put all your energies on that, and take that to the logical conclusion.
Sure. Srini, according to you?
So according to me, I think the G20, I mean, we don't have much more things to do. I mean, the year is done. Today, we will have the common consensus. But I think more interestingly, as I said earlier, if you're going to have milestone goal-based approach that we're going to have, who's going to track them month on month or year on year and say, hey, we agreed on this last year? I mean, it reminds me of the corporate reviews, right? We always start off with what did we commit in the previous review and where are we on that? If we can do that approach in, let's say, G20 or any multilateral issues, I think we'll be far better off. So my wish list is milestone-based, deliverable-based approach. I think would be far better than just using English.
Sure. Now, coming to the last part of the conversation, Srini, US President Joe Biden, when he stepped on the Indian soil, he again reiterated for India to be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Considering the geopolitics right now, the situation in Ukraine, where do you think India should be placed? I mean, India's approach has been using the right words as far as the war is concerned, but still, all the leaders are refusing to come out with a joint statement. Where do you think geopolitics is headed as far as G20 is concerned?
So I think
In
forget
the absence of
G20.
leaders like China and Russia as well, yeah.
So I think those will continue, right? I mean, irrespective of whether it is G20 or United Nations, we have to continue pushing our own, I wouldn't say narrative or just an agenda, but our own interest. We'll have to keep pushing it. We have seen time and again that China thwart the efforts of India to name, even designate a terrorist who was involved in the Indian attack, right? Despite all the global concerns that everybody has spoken about terrorism, but simple thing like getting an individual designated as a global terrorist has been thwarted. So I think some of these, and that's why I said, right, I mean, what we hear from the political narrative and what goes behind, I'm sure there is a lot of behind backroom conversations that are happening. And again, it all goes back to the domestic agenda that each of them have to stand for. India going into Security Council, I don't think we can narrate it anymore. And I think it's very similar to, or probably worse than, what we are talking about, the entire redesign of UN as a multilateral institute that we've been talking about. Not only India, India has been vocal in the last couple of months, but the world has been speaking about whether UN is effective at all. It's almost like the old teacher trying to mind a bunch of very boisterous children in a loud
The
class.
league, which was there
Are they
before Second
effective?
World
That's
War,
the question now.
like the Nations League before Second World War. Mr. Garg, your opinion, please.
See, about the geopolitics and these kind of things, my sense is, I hinted this earlier. Uh, Remember, the Chinese economy now is $18 trillion strong. US economy is about 25 trillion. China has become almost equal to what the US is. And even there is a growth differential. So in times to come,
The Chinese
we
economy
are,
has been slowing down for the last 2 years.
see, you may draw comfort by that, but a 18 trillion panda, and we are at 3.5 trillion or less than 4 trillion. Even if we grow by 10%, we add $400 billion. And if China grows by 3%, it grows by $500 billion. So, and with Chinese population now declining and India is still sort of growing in terms of that. So we become worse off in per capita terms, even if China grows 3% and we grow 10%. And we are not going to grow 10%. And many times when we say that the population is an advantage, demographic advantage, etc., in the world of today with almost everything mechanized and now digitalized, the human numbers don't offer you any great advantage. In fact, it's a more of a liability. So my sense is that in geopolitical terms, these two poles are going to get more and more strengthened. We are in no position to become the third pole anytime. We will have to work very hard in case we have ambitions for that. So whether a Security Council membership, permanent membership, not a veto membership, even a permanent membership for the class which doesn't exist today, I don't think in this bipolar world anything like that is going to happen very soon. So you may keep on wishing it, you may keep on trying it, keep the conversation, keep the pot boiling, but don't really expect and put any in the store for or to derive any advantage. I don't think that kind of advantage. The real advantage would come if you are able to grow strongly at about 8 to 10% for next 25 years. That is what will bring the real strength to India. Not that we are growing at a rate higher than the US or advanced countries, or we are one of the largest growth countries, etc. 6.5% is too low a growth for India's need. I think that is where we
Oh.
should view the geopolitics as well as our future growth agenda, rather than trying to score some brownie or short-term points to my mind.
Sure. Mr. Esiga, Srinath Sridharan, thank you so much for coming on Live Mint and speaking to us. This was indeed a pleasure. Thank you so much. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you very much.